Hello, everyone. I think my mic is working, which means that our session is starting. Thank you so much for making it into the room just after lunch. Happy to have you all here. This is a panel, which means that we will try to give you some work and have participate in our conversation. We will kick it off with people on the, well, not stage, but in front of the stage, sitting on these taller chairs to chat about a few pre-cooked questions, and hopefully that will inspire you to add comments or questions on your own to the conversation. So please feel empowered and encouraged to do so. Today, we are looking at villages of people working on open source within companies, or well, on your own personal interest too. We probably sprinkled that in there as well. But we felt like that it's important to talk about different job roles that concern open source outside of the usual suspects of open source software developers, because yes, they are absolutely crucial to write code, but open source and sustaining open source communities and the open source ecosystem, open source work, upstream work within a company, none of that is straightforward, so there are a lot more responsibilities to be taken care of. And with that, I will very briefly just tell you that my name is Ildiko Vancha. I work as Director of Community at the Open Infra Foundation. I've been with the foundation for almost 9 years now, so I've been spending a lot of time with supporting open source software development communities. And with that, I will pass it on to Ray next to me to introduce himself.
All right, thanks, Ildiko. Hi, my name is Ray Paik. I'm a community manager for TiDB community. So if you see my bio, the company name is PinkCap, so we have an interesting challenge of having the company name different from the project name. But we also contribute a couple of projects to the CNCF. If you're part of the CNCF community, you might have heard of TiKV, which is a key value data store, and Chaos Mesh. So yeah, that's what I do day to day.
Thanks, Ray. My name is Ria Shaunat, and I am the Open Source Compliance Manager with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise's Open Program Office. So we actually changed from an OSPO to an OPPO, and I'll talk more about that later.
Okay, and I am Charles Eckel. I'm in the Global Technology Standards group at Cisco. So as you heard there, yes, I'm a standards guy, so a little different than my colleagues here. But throughout my career, I've always worked with standards and with open source, and ideally with some combination of the two, which is where I hope we can be. So I'll talk more about that during the course of the panel.
Amazing. And now that you know who we all are, I will ask my panelists to talk a little bit more about your job roles a little bit, why you feel that this particular job role is important, and if you had any other open source related job roles in the past that you feel are also important to mention, please sprinkle those in as well. And maybe let's start with Ria this time.
Thanks, Ildiko. So I started out as a computer programmer. I got my undergrad degree in computer science and started working in coding, and then decided to shift gears and went to law school instead. I was going to law school specifically for software licensing, but during the course of time that I was there, the United States Patent and Trademark Office opened up their computer-related guidelines for computer software. So I ended up then splitting between half patents, half software licensing. It was at a time before open source licensing was quite mainstream, so I never took any classes in law school related to open source and got my basis in that when I started working on mergers and acquisitions for my first law firm once I had graduated. Spent about 20 some years working in law, and 4 years ago decided to switch gears back to the business side and joined Hewlett-Packard Enterprise's Open Program Office so that I could focus on a combination of process management, understanding the projects, taking the licensing background that I had to bring value to that group, but then also being able to expand everything I'm learning about open source and open artificial intelligence, which is why we are now an open program office, not just an OSPO.
Okay, yeah. So I started out in computer science and engineering also, and I've really spent my whole career as a software developer to some extent. Started out in the telecom space with Northern Telecom. Those of you who remember Northern Telecom, then became Nortel, and then became out of business. And then a lot of time with Cisco, with some startup time in between. And so right from the very start, though, standards were very important in the telecom industry. I'd say 90+% of all countries kind of follow the same standard. But then there's that last bit, you know, the 5–10% where they get different. And that was the big challenge. So I really came to appreciate standards and how it made at least that 90%, you know, usable across the entire world. And then during the, in 1999, I left Nortel and I went to a startup. And there I was implementing telecom stuff, voice over IP stuff, and open source was hot. So we were open sourcing everything, and we were making use of a lot of open source too. And so I think at that time, I grasped how important and the power of open source. And ever since at Cisco, I've been combining those two. And Cisco in the networking space and also in the telecom space, open source and standards really fit very nicely together.
Yeah, so I think my full-time journey in open source started like around 2014 when I actually started working at the Linux Foundation, and that's where I met like people like Charles and Ildiko. Was involved in a number of networking-related projects. And I think most of my focus in terms of community management was making sure that contributors have a good experience, like onboarding, making sure that reviews are getting done, et cetera, et cetera. And then after 4 years at the LF, I worked in the community team at GitLab. And I mean, a lot of my work was involved with working with the contributors too. But what I also started doing was working with some of the users, like people that are not necessarily contributing code, but that are heavy users of GitLab and organizing meetups and doing a lot of good community work in general. Because what I noticed was that although they're not providing code, because in the old days, I think code was like the #1 asset of open source projects, but what was more important was like their insights, their user experience, making sure that people are having a good experience. And after a couple of years at GitLab, I went to Cube. It's a small company. I think it's still pretty small. I left Cube like 2 years ago. But what was interesting, before we had a commercial product making revenue, like all of our users were open source users, right? And then it was kind of interesting, like the VCs were looking at metrics in terms of how many users there are. And then I think it was like Series A funding, like unbeknownst to me, they were calling our open source users, they found their contact information through Slack, and then community members would ping me, oh, by the way, so-and-so from VC company called me about, and don't worry, I give you good reviews. So that actually gave me like I'm glad they were happy. That it obviously gave us a tangible benefit so that we can get a next round of funding. So I saw the power of that aspect of open source community. And now I've been at PinCap for a little over 2 years. We're a 10-year-old project. And then I actually found a user here in the US that's been using our product since version 1.0, which was like 10 years ago. Like I was like floored. And then one thing that always impresses me is that these open source users are your biggest fans. They can be your biggest critic, but they're your biggest fans. And I really appreciate their insight, whether it's like good or bad.
So we have a really nice diversity of different job roles and journeys of how people on the stage got into open source and have been staying around open source. So a bit of an exercise for the audience. Who is a software developer, open source software developer in this room? We have, I don't know, maybe a quarter of the room. Who is in academia, education and teaching open source? We have a couple of people. Oh, yeah, a few. Okay, who is a manager who have teams or a few people working on open source? All right, another quarter-ish. Any executives in the room? Oh yeah, we have that too. Amazing. I love that. Community manager? That too. I love it. With how the job market has been and job security, who feels secure in their current position today? Like, raise your hand if you feel that your job as is, working on open source, will remain as is, and you will not get laid off in the next, I don't know, 3 to 6 months.
And I'm retired.
Cool, I love it. But we still have people in the room who didn't raise their hands, and I think this is why it is so important that we are talking about why the different functions and responsibilities are crucial to have and have covered within companies. One thing that I, from a personal experience, often see as a mismatch is, for example, when you have an open source related or open source something named job title, like where it sits in the organizational structure, especially within bigger companies, that does matter a lot, in my experience. And let's explore what the panel's experience is. Ray, I will drop this question to you. Like, where is your current job role sitting? What department, and do you feel it's a good fit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I remember like a first community leadership summit I went to, I think this was like 2015. The conversation was, where do our jobs fit in as a community manager? That was like a big debate. So currently I report to our head of marketing at the company, and this is the second, so I was part of like a different group last year, and we had a reorg. I'm part of marketing, and even at GitLab, our group was ultimately reporting to the CMO. And my philosophy has always been, as long as your CMO or chief of marketing or whatever the title is, they understand the value of community and understand the value of your work, I don't think it creates a lot of conflict. Like, I don't get pressure in terms of, hey, you went to so-and-so event, like how many lead scans did you get? Like, that's not what my boss like asked me about. Like, he realizes that it's more about awareness and educating them on our project versus how many of these we're gonna convert into leads. That leads to a very awkward discussion for especially somebody like me who's a poor salesperson. So yeah, I mean, I think as long as ultimately your boss or a head of marketing understands the value of community, and then it's, you're not being forced into doing the salesy type of work. I think that works. But I know I'm pretty fortunate. I know that's not an experience with everybody. But yeah, so there's some balancing work that needs to be done in marketing. But so far so good.
Charles,
Yeah,
Charles, go ahead.
I would say earlier on in my career, when I was focused almost entirely on software development, I always had a strong appreciation for standards and for open source. But I'd say it was a little bit harder for me to get either buy-in from management to give back or to go to events like this. Or even if they did support it, then it wasn't necessarily something that helped me in my career, or at least in how they would view my performance. It was like, that's something we let Charles do because he likes it, but it's not valuable to us. And I'd say, fortunately, because of a lot of the great work I think all of us are doing collectively, more and more people are realizing value of open source and of standards. And while I still wouldn't feel entirely secure in my job because things do change, I think one of the beautiful things about it is like the skill set and the relationships you build with people outside of your company. And now it's like, well, if you need to look for another job, at least you have that network. And the skills you built, a lot of them are not just so specific to your immediate job role, that you could do that sort of similar thing elsewhere. So, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't say I don't lose sleep over it, because I think there's lots of opportunities.
I'll close it out to let you know for transparency that our open program office rolls up into our legal department. But I really don't think that's particularly important. What's important on a day-to-day basis or a quarter-over-quarter basis is what value are you bringing to the company? And I've worked for law firms that had 200 employees, and I've worked for AWS, which is one of the world's largest companies, and many places in between. And what I can say is what value you're bringing is what's important for your job security and who you're communicating that value to. So cross-collaboration is absolutely critical wherever you sit. And we happen to sit in legal, that's fine, but I have to cross-collaborate with product security. Some of my colleagues collaborate with the chief technical office, with strategy, with the various business units, with marketing, with legal itself, and many other groups besides. So making sure that you're conveying that message, and also that this is a constantly moving area, whether you're in standards like Charles or you're doing compliance, working in a high-tech area like a database like Ray is, you are constantly moving and constantly having to reinvent yourself. If you let the grass grow under your feet, then you're going to be left behind. So keep moving forward.
So what I'm hearing the panel say is that you need to be adaptable, you need to communicate clearly, and sometimes there's some education thrown into the mix as well. So not just cross-collaboration, but if your manager in the marketing department may not understand open source, then you should make sure that the sentence is they don't understand open source yet. And then you have the opportunity to help them figure out how this ecosystem works and how open source works. And we do talk about collaboration and skills and all the things, and we talk about companies and business, but I want to throw a question at Charles to cover standards and open source and collaboration a little bit to help us understand how that segment works, and maybe sprinkle in a little bit like how your job role factors into supporting your company navigate that space and collaboration.
Yeah, happy to. You may not be able to see the details of this shirt, but this is actually from an IETF meeting. It's kind of, I think it says Return of the Nerds, because we were in Hawaii for a conference. So IETF is one of the places where I spend a lot of time, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Hopefully, how many of you are familiar with it? Okay, great, because I mean, if you use the internet, you're using our protocols, DNS, HTTP, TLS, I mean, all the things that the internet runs on. And one of the things I started there was the IETF hackathons. And it started out as just an experiment where it's like, hey, we're creating all these internet standards. Interoperability is super important. What if we're implementing these things at the same time that we are working on the standards? So we tried an experiment where the weekend before the IETF meeting, we had people come. I did some arm twisting, had like 4 projects, and about 40 people showed up, and we started writing some code on the latest versions of some standards we were working on, and the idea just like caught fire. And what I realized is there's a lot more in common between open source communities and standards communities, certainly between the IETF and like say the Linux Foundation. That there's a lot of commonality there. And so now I'd say maybe 40% of the people who come to an IETF meeting come the weekend before and participate in this, working on code. And it's not only improving the standards because you're learning and feeding back into the standards, but really importantly, and hopefully a lot of people here would appreciate this, if you have code, and particularly open source code, that implements a standard, it improves adoption of that standard and deployment of that standard, because now you don't need to read this spec and start from scratch or ask ChatGPT to write some code for you. You can actually take some code that people have developed and have been using and use it to jumpstart your own use of that standard. So I think from a standards perspective, there's a lot of benefits we get from open source, right? A better standard, easier to deploy the standard. And from a open source perspective, I'd say the open source community gets a lot of benefit because when you add support for that standard into your open source project, now your open source project is usable by a whole new set of potential, users. Say if it's a telecom-based stack, and now you add support into it. Now it's like the telecom industry can use your stuff. So I think it's really a win-win, and so that's what I try to look for, those opportunities.
So kind of your company benefits from how the ecosystem is thriving and how the standards and open source projects and code intersect and work together.
Yeah, definitely. It's an easy sell to my company because they care a lot about IETF, and now they see, wow, this work that you're doing is benefiting the IETF, and keep doing it. So yeah, good return on investment.
Amazing. I will rephrase this question for Ray and Ria a little bit too. Like, can you mention any key skills that you can think of for your job role that are important, and how that feeds back into having your job role helping the company to engage with open source better, or what value the companies is having from having you take the responsibilities and fulfill them within your job role?
Well, I think being in open source or any kind of open, the technology is always moving. I just mentioned that before. So having an open mindset where you're willing to learn and willing to try to dig in and figure out these problems, that's a key skill set to have. I came to the Open Program Office from a licensing background, and when I first took the job on, I thought my job was going to be licensing compliance, and it is. That's part of my job. But so much more has happened in the industry in the 4 years that I've been at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, including the focus on software bill of materials, SBOMs, first with President Biden's executive order 14028, and now with the European Union's Cyber Resilience Act. So I have to cross-collaborate very heavily with our product security office so that we can work together on solving those problems for the company, and then even more broadly work externally outside of HPE with the OpenSSF, with various groups like Clearly Defined to help bring in information, with the Chaos organization that focuses on health analytics, that while some projects may not have a CVE today, if they've got a poor health profile, they may be ripe for having a CVE tomorrow, and we should be paying attention to those kinds of things. And then outside of even the open source groups, the United States government has an entity called CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency under the Department of Homeland Security. They developed some community groups targeted around dealing with the SBOM question, and that was very open source in nature as well. It was extremely collaborative, and you had dozens of people from different companies all talking to one another about how do we standardize on creating an SBOM? How do we develop best practices that we can communicate and share across all of our companies? Because this is not about market differentiating technology. This is about solving a foundational layer thing that everybody needs in order to be able to use software safely.
I think it's pretty similar to what Ria was saying. I don't know if I do this particularly well, but I consider my number one responsibility is to bring different people together so they feel comfortable collaborating and sharing. And then when I remember like Charles was talking about hackathon, we happened to have an event at the same venue in Korea, and I got to his room for the hackathon, and it looked like any other hackathon I've been to for open source projects. People are happy to come together and start working, and it just looked the same, and it's just a safe environment. So no matter who they are, like from different backgrounds, or even like it could be our competitors these days. I just had opportunity to organize a dev room at FOSDEM. I think there are a lot of people from Europe, so you may have heard of FOSDEM. And we knew as a community on our own, like it was very unlikely that our dev room proposal was going to get accepted. So I called, I met with some of our other companies that are our competitors, like companies like PlanetScale and Yugabyte that are sort of in our space, and I pinged all of them, and they came back with yeah, we'll be happy to work with you. It's like, in true open source fashion. We have our corporate hats, we wear our corporate hats, but this was like a bigger cause that we wanted to work towards to talk about a new database category called distributed SQL. So we came together, we organized a dev room together, and we had end users and presenters from different companies, but it worked pretty well. Like we at the end of the dev room, we all even went out for beers together, and it looked like almost like a collaborative project in a foundation. So even though we're not under any umbrella, we thought this was important to collaborate and work together, and hope to be able to do that again at future events. But I thought it was really cool. Like I was very happy with the experience, and yeah, like I said, my number one job is to bring people together and make sure that they feel comfortable working together.
So it sounds like that you all are saying that on one hand, collaboration and information sharing is crucial, and having job roles within companies focusing on facilitating and accelerating that is very important. And it also sounds like that things like community management, it's not only for open source foundations. So if you're within a corporate organization, community management, whether it's in the open source community or even creating internal communities, that is something that you also need to keep in mind and think about. We can dive into this. However, in the interest of time and getting audience involvement, I gotta throw the question around. Any questions, comments, and I'm...
Well, Ria, if you could go back to the SBOM, before I retired, I was a VP of an architecture team for a very large travel corporation, and I had to deal with the SBOMs, all kinds of stuff. But now I'm working with OpenAPI and something called the Open Travel Alliance. When we produce code, what could we be doing to make it easier for adoption as the code goes out the door? Any forms of documentation or other things we could do to try to make it easier for somebody to adopt?
Are you talking about adopting creation of an SBOM?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Correct. As I push the code out there and somebody goes to adopt it, how can I make their life easier to get the certifications and everything they need?
Well, definitely having the SBOM is really great.
Just publish it with the code.
If you can. Okay. Sometimes you can't always put that information in. Sometimes it's a question of you can provide the SBOM to a direct client because you've got a contract and there might be confidentiality agreements in place. But if you're open sourcing a project, if you've got an open project, making sure you've got an SBOM along with that. And also, given some of the new regulatory regimes coming out, particularly the Cyber Resilience Act, making sure you're aligning with things security-wise, whether it's the OpenSSF best practices, the scorecard, or their new program, which is the baseline that maps to specific areas of both the best practices badge, OWASP, and the Cyber Resilience Act to say these are the must-dos. And you can self-attest right now to baseline, but by using that as your rubric to let others understand what you are paying attention to and what you have certified you've done, that could help with adoption of an open project.
Other questions, comments?
I'll add one more little bit in there just because I come from a licensing background. One of the things that I have found in the onslaught of chasing after SBOMs is that the SBOMs come out of the cybersecurity world. They come out of the product security world, and their focus has been on being able to develop that inventory so you could test it against a vulnerability database and say, does this particular project have a vulnerability, an exploit, et cetera, and being able to monitor that. They've been less diligent about making sure they get the licensing and the pieces that are necessary for open source compliance into those SBOMs. And so that's an area that I've been very heavily focusing on, because even having the license understanding is part of maintaining and controlling your operational risk in utilizing open source. You could have two pieces of open source that just don't play together because of the licensing, or you might have a project that you've developed a dependency on that has a particular license, and then maybe those maintainers or those project owners decide to change the license. And not having that licensing information in your SBOM creates an operational risk, because you may not, depending on your corporate policies or your personal proclivities, whatever they are, you may not be able to align with that new type of license.
I can add a workforce question. In my role, I have a pretty big mouth anyway.
We need to catch it on the recording.
In my role as, running that, and the architects I did had to cat herd 3,000 developers, I still put it actually in their job description to spend 10% of their time on a community effort. I wasn't very specific what, mostly open source stuff, standards or whatever, but that was a very hard sell to fellow executives. So I'm still finding that now that I'm depending on volunteer work to get some of the Open API work. And so that's just a campaign at Open API in particular. We're trying to find messaging to get to the leaders that are sitting on our governing board that said the best thing you could possibly do for us is not make the volunteers work nights and weekends. Actually give them time. So I don't know if any of you have any comments on how to encourage leadership. Cut the developers and engineers some slack. Actually give them some time and put it in their job description.
Yeah, I applaud you for doing that, first of all. But unfortunately, the way, in cases where that really worked, is it needs to be role modeled by the leaders at the company. Like, it was particularly the case at GitLab, and even at PinCap, our CTO, for example, is very, very prolific, like going to like a different meetups and participating in different communities. So I think the role modeling is like very, very important. Like, and whether you put that in the job description or not, if you see your leaders like role modeling that, and even yourself, like role modeling that, I think that gives people permission that it's okay to spend an hour a week or whatever it is, like, helping other community members in an upstream, right? So I think best way that what I've seen is basically role modeling, especially by like the founders. So yeah, I'm not sure if that helps.
And I'd add a couple things. I would imagine with that 10%, you got a lot of value back. I mean, one, in retaining those people, because they were probably happy to have that time. But two, probably a lot of contributions back to your project where you benefited and the company benefited. And I think celebrating and almost advertising all that return on investment that you got, so other people see, hey, with that 10%, here's all the goodness that happens. And I think as a community in open source, we maybe don't spend enough time evangelizing that, and in standards too, so that you really need to, I don't know if toot your own horn, but you need to make sure that others understand the tremendous value that you're getting as a result of that 10% investment.
In some cases, I was able to show the CFO an actual ROI, but in other cases, you all already mentioned it. The information they come back with, finding how other people were solving similar problems that we had and everything. So it was harder to quantify that to other leadership, but I certainly saw it like, okay, it would have taken us a while to figure that out. Somebody else already fixed it.
Yeah. I mean, one other example that's been helpful for us at my current company, PinCap, is do a hackathon. You have the permission to use these hours or these 2 days to hack on upstream work or fix documentation. So we had an internal hackathon to celebrate our 10-year anniversary. I know that sounds very geeky, but it actually, like I talked to engineers, it gave them permission to like take risks. Like I don't know if they probably spent nights and weekends like doing some of that work, but it gave them permission to take risks and do something very different and look at things very differently. So giving them sort of permission, like here's a time-bound thing that you can do, like call it a hackathon or whatever it is. I think that's another way to encourage a lot of those upstream activities, I think.
Here's another one that I lean into a lot. We have a program, and I think a lot of corporations have this as well, where you can donate your time to a 501c3 organization, and you can get a certain allotment of hours that are granted to you by the company. At HPE, we get 60 hours a year to engage in volunteer efforts. There are a lot of open source organizations that are 501c3s. I've looked them up, and not all of them. Unfortunately, the Linux Foundation is a 501c6, so I can't use Linux Foundation ones for this, but I can use.
Most of them are 501c6s, so we'd like to be included.
Well, I would love that, but that gets into tax laws, so that's something that's a little bit beyond my ambit to take care of. But there are still a lot of 501c3 organizations, and you can lean into those in order to give those volunteer hours and have that bank of hours that's not nights and weekends, but get people to have that bug and get hooked on doing something open source oriented. And then once you are a believer, once you are part of this community and you are personally experiencing that value, then I think you're going to seek out other opportunities to continue that train.
And I will throw in a new idea, because Ria already mentioned the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU. And once it takes effect, one thing that is part of the CRA currently and the processes that they are building to execute it is manufacturers of digital products that are made available on the EU market. If there is an exploited known vulnerability in it, the manufacturer is obligated to report that to both government agencies as well as the makers of the open source projects if the issue in their product is in an open source component. And on top of that, if they have a fix, they are also obligated to provide that fix to the community as a starting point to address that vulnerability. So what the CRA is pointing towards and what it means is that the responsibility chain for vulnerabilities ends with the company. It's not finger pointing anymore that, oh, well, the issue is in the open source component in my product, so it's Joe's problem who wrote the code in the open source community. I have nothing to do with it. It ends here. And I don't know the numbers by heart, but you can look it up in the CRA on what the fines will be if you don't comply. So this is where companies will have to start to be accountable for the products that they are building, including the open source components that they are integrating into their products that they are making available on that EU market. So at that point, the question is how fast they can adopt the current product development and maintenance workflow to include open source work, hopefully upstream first, in the sense that it's not like, oh, I fixed everything in my product downstream that I thought there was, and then I may or may not, provide that fix upstream, but it's always overhead, it's always a headache and an additional cost. I think we are approaching the stage where companies will be a little bit more forced than in the past to rethink how to do sustainable software development by collaborating on that core digital infrastructure. Food for thought.
Yeah, just I would add to that. I mean, I hope with the CRA what we see is more upstream contributions, specifically bug fixes, but just even in general. Once you start to see the benefit of, hey, we contributed these 2 patches upstream, and now we're using the upstream version ourselves, and 50 other fixes got contributed by other people, and we just plugged in that new version. Wow, that was a lot easier than backporting all this stuff from other people into our own, company-specific version of that. And I think with standards, we've seen that for a long time already working well, because the value the standard provides is interoperability. So if there's a problem with the standard or an ambiguity in the standard, everyone wants to get that resolved with an errata or a new version of it so that you do have interoperability. Whereas with open source, it might have been a little bit more challenging to get people the incentives for the upstream contribution. And now I think this just, puts the balances even more in the favor of contributing upstream. So I hope that's a benefit that comes.
I also have an ask, and I saw a couple of people raise their hand that they were involved in education in the audience. So I have an ask for educators to make sure you are conveying the philosophy of open source. This is a longer run here because I know you were asking about selling it to executives, and your students are 40 years away from being executives, or maybe they're only 10 or 15 years away from being executives. Hopefully, maybe it's the latter. But if they understand at the very beginning of their careers, while they're still being educated, the philosophy behind open source, if they understand how to engage in these communities, if it's already a part of their mind fabric, then they bring that to the corporations they join down the line. And they already have these good habits in place that then they can push up the stream. But when it's a group of people that are well known to each other and we're all speaking to the choir, we're not getting that into the next generation that's coming up. And there was a great session yesterday about how students are reticent about engaging in these communities. We need to make sure the students are engaging so that they will come and then share these ideas with everybody else.
And that was the closing for our panel because we are out of time. So please come and catch us offline. We are giving the microphones back. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance, and come talk to us.